Sometime in the middle of July, in the year 1518, in the free imperial city of Strasbourg, a woman stepped out of her house into one of the narrow streets that ran down toward the river, and she began to dance. There was no music. That is the first strange thing, and it is worth sitting with before anything else. Nobody was playing. There was no festival that week, no Saint's Day being kept, no wedding winding through the lanes with pipes and drums. It was an ordinary working morning in an ordinary Alsatian summer, hot and close, and a woman came out of a doorway into a street full of people going about their business. And she started to move, and she did not stop. She danced, according to the accounts that survive, for somewhere between 4 and 6 days. Not in bursts, continuously, so far as anyone watching could tell, through the daylight and through the dark, pausing only to collapse briefly into sleep, and then rising and beginning again. Her husband came out to her. He is not named. He tried to bring her back inside, and she did not seem to hear him. What the accounts agree on is that she would not stop, and that by the 3rd day, the skin of her feet had opened, and there was blood in her shoes. Her name in most of the retellings is Frau Troffea. I want to be careful with that name, because how carefully we handle it will decide what kind of episode this is. Of the 6 old chronicle accounts of that summer, 4 give her that name, and none of those 4 is a document written in 1518. The name reaches us through the chronicle tradition, through men copying and tidying each other's accounts across the following century. It may be real. It may equally be an accretion, a name that attached itself to an anonymous woman because a story is easier to carry when somebody in it has a name. John Waller of Michigan State University, the historian who has written most about this, is noticeably more cautious in his academic writing than in his popular writing. Sometime in mid-July of 1518, he writes, "A lone woman stepped into one of its narrow streets and began a dancing vigil." A lone woman, not Frau Troffea. He knows what the sources will bear. So, a woman in a street in the middle of July. That is as close to solid as anything in this story gets. We will keep returning tonight to the distinction between what the record contains and what has been built on top of it, because the distinction turns out to be the story. Within a week, 34 other people were dancing, and they were not, by any account we have, enjoying it. This is the detail most modern retellings lose, and it changes everything. The dancers of Strasbourg were not celebrating. The chronicles describe convulsive, spasmodic movement, arms flailing, eyes glassy and turned somewhere else, clothes soaked through with sweat, day after day, never changed. Feet swelling inside shoes that had long since stopped fitting. They seldom stopped to eat or to drink, and when they surfaced, when whatever had hold of them loosened for an hour, they were frightened. They begged the people standing around them for help. They asked for priests. Waller's judgment is that they must have been in some kind of altered state. Only in an altered state of consciousness, he writes, could they have tolerated such extreme fatigue and the searing pain of sore, swollen, and bleeding feet. Whatever this was, it was happening to them. It was not something they were doing. Through late July and into August it spread. The Imlin chronicle gives 400 by the end of the month, in a city of perhaps 20 to 25,000. That 400 is single source, and across the chronicles the estimates range from about 50 to 400, a spread wide enough to tell you nobody was really counting. But even 50 people dancing in the streets of a working city for weeks in high summer would be the strangest thing that had happened in living memory. Now, the deaths. You have probably heard this story before in some form. And if you have, the thing you probably remember is that people dance themselves to death. 15 a day at the height of it. Hearts giving out. I need to tell you plainly that the contemporary records of Strasbourg do not mention a single death. Not one. The dancing is in the record. The council's emergency measures are in the record, in the municipal archive. The staging, the ordinances, the fines, the pilgrimage, all of it. And there is no body count. The vivid death language, men who began to dance day and night until finally they fell down unconscious and succumbed to death, comes from an anonymous astrological chronicle written in 1636, 118 years later. And there is a parallel that ought to give us pause. In 1374, along the Rhine and the Mosel, there was a much larger outbreak of the same phenomenon, described by dozens of independent town chronicles. One of the best attested strange events of the medieval period. Not one of those contemporary chronicles reports a fatality either. So here is where we stand. Something happened in Strasbourg in the summer of 1518. People danced involuntarily, in great distress, for weeks. The city responded in a way we will come to, which is very well documented and very strange. And whether anybody actually died of it is the part the documents are quietest about. Let me put you in the city, briefly, because the city matters. Strasbourg in 1518 was a free imperial city, self-governing, answerable in theory to the emperor, and in practice to nobody much. It sat on the river Ill, a little west of the Rhine, where the trade of the upper Rhine valley met the roads coming down out of the Vosges. And it was not a sleepy provincial town where a strange thing happened in the dark. It was rich, crowded, and intensely literate. Strasbourg had the first printing offices anywhere outside Mainz, and roughly 70 printers set up there in the 2 decades around 1518. It had a legal bureaucracy, a written constitution, and a habit of keeping records, which is exactly why we know as much as we do, and exactly why the silences in the record are worth taking seriously. By the last week of July, this had stopped being a curiosity and become a civic emergency. And the men who ran Strasbourg did what the men who ran a 16th century city did when something inexplicable was happening in the streets. They sent for the doctors. The city's chancellor, its chief legal officer, the man whose handwriting appears on some of the orders we are about to discuss, was Sebastian Brant, who had written, 24 years earlier, one of the most widely read books in Europe, Das Narrenschiff, The Ship of Fools, a long satirical poem cataloguing every variety of human folly. It contains, as it happens, a chapter on the folly of dancing, The man who wrote the book about fools was the man now sitting in the chamber, trying to work out what to do about 400 people dancing in his streets. The physicians came, they examined the afflicted, and they delivered a verdict. Having excluded astrological causes and having excluded supernatural causes, the medical fraternity of Strasbourg declared this to be a natural disease caused by hot blood. The Galenic body was governed by 4 humours, and health was their balance. Blood was hot and wet, and an excess of it would cook the brain, understood to be naturally cool and moist, producing exactly the symptoms of a distempered mind: anger, rashness, wildness, uncontrolled motion. It was a diagnosis with a mechanism, arrived at by trained men who had considered the alternatives and ruled them out. The treatment is where it stops being ordinary. You would expect bleeding. Open a vein, draw off the surplus, cool the patient with rest and a darkened room. That is not what they prescribed. They prescribed more dancing. The reasoning was that the hot blood had to be burned off, and the only way to burn it was through the fever itself. The dancers would recover their minds, the authorities announced, only if they persisted, day and night, until it was out of them. And then the city of Strasbourg did something I still find genuinely difficult to absorb 500 years later. It built them somewhere to do it. They cleared 2 guild halls. Our source for which ones is Daniel Specklin, the city architect, writing 60 or 70 years afterward. So treat the specifics gently. He names the carpenter's hall and the tanner's hall. They cleared the open-air grain market, and opposite the horse market, they had a wooden stage constructed, purpose-built, carpentered, presumably by the same guild whose hall had just been emptied. Then the council hired musicians, drums, fiddles, pipes, horns, paid out of the city's own money, and they hired professional dancers, healthy ones, to dance alongside the sick. And then, because even that was not sufficient, they hired strong men. The strong men were there to hold the afflicted upright. An open market square in the middle of a hot August, a wooden stage, hundreds of exhausted, filthy, half-delirious people in sweat-rotted clothes, moving in a way that does not look like dancing so much as it looks like being moved. Around them, hired professionals dancing properly, keeping the rhythm. And among them, men whose entire job is to catch the ones who fall and keep them going. Every time the sick flagged, or fainted, or slowed, the musicians raised the tempo of their playing, and the hired dancers held them firm and quickened their pace. The elites of Strasbourg, acting on the best medical advice available to them, in complete good faith, had constructed in the public squares of their city a spectacle of engineered suffering. There is one line about it from a man who appears to have been there. The Alsatian humanist Hieronymus Gebweiler, writing at the time, said this: "They danced day and night with those poor people." It did not work. Through the first half of August, the dancing did not diminish. It grew. And at some point that month, the council looked at what it had built and came to a conclusion that must have been very difficult for a body of confident, educated men to reach. They had made it worse. What follows is a sequence of escalating orders through August, dates drawn from different retellings of the archival record and not perfectly reconciled. On or around the 3rd of August, a ban on dancing, recorded in Brant's own hand, a fine of 30 shillings, to run until Michaelmas, the 29th of September. Around the 10th of August, a further order. Every person must take care of his own people, and the various guilds should examine their members and send those who were ailing to St Vitus. Remember that name. It is about to become the whole story. And around the 28th of August, the full reversal. All public dancing banned. All public music banned. The gambling houses shut. The brothels closed. The disorderly driven out beyond the city gates. There is one exception written into the ordinance, and it is my favorite surviving detail of the whole episode because it is so administratively human. Families celebrating a wedding or a priest's first mass were permitted music, but stringed instruments only, and they had to swear a solemn oath in advance that they would not use tambourines or drums. You can watch the reasoning work itself out. Strings are gentle. Strings do not carry. It is the percussion that does it. It is the beat that gets in. Somebody in that chamber had watched what the hired drummers did to 400 people in the grain market and had concluded that the rhythm itself was the vector. Because the diagnosis had changed. That is the real content of the reversal. They had decided, in Waller's phrase, that the dance had nothing to do with putrefying blood cooking, normally moist and cool brains. They now believed it was a curse, sent down by an angry saint. And once you believe that, the response is no longer medical, it is penitential. You do not treat a curse. You go and ask, in the correct manner, in the correct place, with the correct objects in your hands, to have it lifted. The worst afflicted were loaded into wagons. They were taken northwest, up into the foothills of the Vosges, about 48 kilometers, to a cave chapel above the town of Saverne, beneath an outcrop of red sandstone. It is called the Grotta St Vitus. It appears in the record from 1338. It is still there, and there a rite was performed over them. The afflicted were laid down beneath a wooden carving of the saint. Small crosses were pressed into their hands. Red shoes were brought out, provided for the ceremony, kept for the purpose, and put on to their ruined feet, and sprinkled with holy water, and crosses painted on the soles and uppers in consecrated oil. A priest said, Mass, and then they were led in procession around the altar, in the red shoes, beneath the carving of the boy saint who had been boiled in oil and lead, and had walked out of the cauldron alive. And within about a week, the stream of pilgrims coming up that hill began to thin. Waller's phrasing, and notice how carefully he phrases it. In the following weeks, the epidemic abated. Most of the dancers, we are told, regained bodily control. We are told, because that is the honest position. The dancing stopped in the late summer of 1518. Whether it stopped because of the red shoes and the consecrated oil, or because the council had finally stopped staging it in the public squares, or because it had simply run its course, the record does not say, and cannot say, and will not say. The dancing stopped. That is all we get. To understand why 400 people fell into the same terrible behavior in the same 8 weeks, you have to understand what it was like to be poor in Alsace in the second decade of the 16th century. It was about as bad as it had been in living memory. Serious famine had come to the country around Strasbourg in 1492, again in 1502, and again in 1511. Then came 1516, when the sun came down on the ripening grain and stayed there, and the harvest failed, and few people in Strasbourg had ever had to pay such high prices for bread. A ferocious winter followed, and in the new year the famine arrived properly, and people began to die of hunger in numbers. There is a Strasbourg chronicler who summed up the year 1517 in 3 words. He called it the bad year. By the early months of 1518, 6 months before a woman stepped into a street and began to dance, the charitable institutions of the city had been completely overwhelmed. The hospitals were full. There was an orphanage with 300 children in it, and leprosy was surging again. And there is one further fact that Waller draws out of the chronicles, and it is the fact that turns all of this from background into cause. There is strong evidence that the poor of Strasbourg were disproportionately affected by the dancing. It was not moving through the patrician houses. It was moving through the people who had spent 2 years hungry. And on the 31st of October, 1517, 9 months, almost to the week, before that woman stepped into the street, Martin Luther made his 95 Theses public. In the summer of 1518, Strasbourg was still an entirely Catholic city, but one in which a great many ordinary people had already concluded that the men who were supposed to intercede for them with God were not doing it. From the Black Forest across to the Vosges, in those years, people were becoming convinced that God had abandoned them. Now, St Vitus. Everything in this episode runs through him. So, who he was, and then 4 pieces of evidence that the people of Alsace were specifically, personally afraid of him. He was, according to the legend, a Sicilian boy, martyred around the year 303 under Diocletian, aged 12 or 13. They put him into a cauldron of boiling lead and tar, and he was not harmed. They threw him to a lion, and the lion came to him and licked his hands. He died, eventually, of his injuries. His feast day is the 15th of June. That will matter in a moment. And Germans kept his feast day by dancing in front of his statue. That is where the name comes from. St Vitus's dance, which survived into modern medicine as the common name for chorea, the involuntary, jerking movement disorder, and survives in English to this day, 400 years after almost everybody stopped knowing who Vitus was. Here is the part that makes the whole thing work, and it is the single most important idea in this episode. A holy helper did not only cure. Late medieval Europeans understood that a saint with power over an affliction had power over it in both directions. The saint who could lift the disease could send it. Curing and cursing were the same authority, pointed differently. If you had offended Vitus, through blasphemy, through neglect, through working on his feast day, then Vitus could give you his dance. 4 pieces of evidence, because any one alone could be explained away, and together they are overwhelming. The first. In the 15th century, There were 2 outbreaks of involuntary dancing in religious buildings in Switzerland. Both occurred on, or immediately before, the 15th of June, St Vitus's Day. The second, in 1509, 9 years before Strasbourg, the abbot Johannes Trithemius completed his chronicle of Sponheim Abbey, and in it referred to the great outbreak of 1374 by a name, S. Weitstands, St Vitus's dance. The connection was already made, already named, already standard. The third. Around the year 1500, an altar panel of St Vitus was installed in a side chapel of Cologne Cathedral. On the painted plinth beneath the saint's feet, there are 3 men, unmistakably dancing, their arms joined together for support because they cannot stand on their own. Somebody painted that in a cathedral 18 years before Strasbourg. It was not a mystery to them. It was iconography. And the fourth, which is the one I find genuinely astonishing. By the late 1400s in the Rhineland, there were phrases in common use that functioned as curses. God give you St Vitus. May St Vitus come to you. And in the town of Rottweil, in the late 1400s, this was written into the statute book. The law provided that if a person cursed another in the name of St Vitus, then the cursed person was expected to develop, and I am quoting the legal language, a fever and St Vitus's dance. There was a law on the books that assumed the curse would work. Not a sermon, not a folk tale, a municipal statute drafted by lawyers in which the involuntary dancing of a human being is treated as the foreseeable legal consequence of a spoken curse. Whatever else you conclude tonight, hold on to that. When the council concluded that an angry saint had cursed the city, they were not reaching for an exotic explanation. They were reaching for the ordinary one, the one that was in the statute books. One last piece of the pattern, and it is geographical. There had been perhaps 10 outbreaks of this thing between the late 1300s and 1518. Every single one occurred along the Rhine and the Mosel. Maastricht, Trier, Zurich, and Strasbourg each had 2 or more. 2 things to notice about that geography. First, it is a river system, a corridor of connection, of boats and trade and pilgrims and news and shared belief. It is not a climate zone, and it is not a crop region. What those valleys have in common is that people and stories move up and down them. Second, and I want to correct something you may have heard, this was not a response to the Black Death. The standard telling has these outbreaks as an aftershock of the plague, and the historian Gregor Rohmann has pointed out that the major episodes do not coincide with the plague waves at all. The dancing did not follow the plague. It followed the river. So, what was it? There are 3 serious answers. This is the long part of the night. Settle in. The first, and the one you have almost certainly heard, is ergot. Claviceps purpurea is a fungus that infects cereal grains, overwhelmingly rye, the bread grain of the poor across northern Europe. It replaces the developing kernel with a hard, dark body sitting in the ear where the grain should be. It thrives in cool, damp conditions at ripening. Wet summers make ergot, and that dark body is full of alkaloids, which constrict the peripheral blood vessels powerfully. They produce 2 clinical pictures. and the distinction matters enormously. The gangrenous form comes from the vasoconstriction. Blood stops reaching the extremities. It begins as an intense burning pain in the hands and feet, the fire they called it, and then the tissue starves and blackens. This is what medieval Europe called St. Anthony's fire, and a religious order was founded around the year 1100, whose entire purpose was nursing people whose limbs were dying of ergot. And we have a modern control case, fully documented, with hospital records. Pont Saint-Esprit, in the south of France. The 15th of August, 1951. Over 250 people were affected. Roughly 50 were committed to asylums. 7 people died. It began with nausea and vomiting, then days of total insomnia, then violent hallucinations and convulsions and limbs that swelled and burned, and in some of the victims, turned gangrenous. It does not look like 400 people dancing in a market square for 6 weeks. The ergot hypothesis has a serious scholarly pedigree. It is not a crank theory, but it has come apart under 7 objections that are individually strong and collectively fatal. 1. Vasoconstriction makes sustained movement impossible. You cannot dance for 4 to 6 days on legs starved of blood and in agony. 2. Gangrene is absent from the accounts, and that is not an argument from silence. These were people who knew gangrenous ergotism by name and had a hospital order dedicated to it. If the dancers' limbs had been dying, that is what the chronicles would have said. 3. The uniformity is implausible. A toxin produces a scatter of symptoms across different doses and different bodies. 1518 produced one stereotyped behavior in hundreds of people. That is not what poisoning looks like. That is what a script looks like. 4. There is no mechanism for social contagion. 1 woman, then 34, then 400. A chemical in the flour does not recruit sequentially. 5. The geography defeats it. Outbreaks clustered along 2 rivers, in regions with different climates and different crops. And a poisoned communal flour supply is not street selective anyway. This followed water, not wheat. 6. The duration is wrong in both directions. Strasbourg produced new cases for 6 to 8 weeks. A contaminated batch of flour is eaten, and then it is gone. 7. And the behavior is simply the wrong behavior. Ergotism produces convulsions and the loss of motor control. The chronicles describe coordinated, rhythmic, purposive-looking dancing. So if it was not the bread, what was it? The dominant modern answer is mass psychogenic illness, and its most prominent advocate is John Waller. His case runs in 3 moves. The first is the stressor, and it rests on archive rather than chronicle. Everything in the previous chapter, the failed harvest, the famine of 1517, the syphilis, the leprosy, the overwhelmed hospitals, is documented, and all of it fell hardest on exactly the people among whom the dancing spread. Waller is careful here and argues against his own thesis in print. Most of the time, he notes, harvest failure and plague and war did not precipitate mass hysteria. Nevertheless, even in a period accustomed to deprivation, the decades preceding 1518 were memorable for their harshness. The second move is the one that makes the theory actually explain something, and it is the idea I would build this whole episode around if it needed one. Distress on its own does not produce dancing. It produces unfocused symptoms: collapse, paralysis, weeping, fits, anything. What made this take this form, in this summer, in this valley, was that everybody there already knew what involuntary dancing was, and who sent it, and what it meant. Walla. In the subconscious minds of those familiar with the state of trance and possession rituals, there is a culture-specific script which directs their feelings and actions. And more simply, even when we lose control, we often do so in culturally prescribed ways. Distress is the fuel. The culture supplies the shape. They danced because St Vitus was the thing you caught in the Rhineland, the way that somewhere else, in some other century, you catch something else. The script was fully written, widely known, and available. The third move is Waller's strongest argument, and I do not think any competing theory has an answer to it. The authorities made it worse, and we can watch them do it. Here is Waller. It is hard to imagine anything better calculated to turn the dance into a full-scale epidemic than making its victims perform in the most public spaces in the city. Each new victim increased the conviction that St Vitus was stalking their city. Think about what the council actually built. They took the afflicted out of the private houses and narrow lanes where they had been, and put them in the grain market, and on a stage opposite the horse market, and in 2 guild halls, the most visible spaces in the city. Then they hired musicians to supply a beat, and dancers to demonstrate the movement, and strong men to make sure the display never stopped. For 4 weeks, every person in that city walked past a continuous, professionally staged, publicly funded demonstration of the exact behavior, accompanied by the exact music, framed as the exact affliction they were all frightened of. And the epidemic tracked it. It grew through the period of the staging. It abated after the staging stopped. No toxin explains that. Ergot in the flower does not know where the wooden stage is. I want to pause on language, because this is the point where it would be easy to be careless in a way that hurts people who are listening. The old term for this is mass hysteria. I have used the historical form of it tonight, and I want to say clearly why it is no longer the term clinicians use. In the current diagnostic manual, the relevant diagnosis is functional neurological disorder, and it is diagnosed by positive findings, not by exclusion. A clinician does not arrive at it by running out of other ideas. And the thing that has to be said plainly, because people with this diagnosis still hear the opposite from medical professionals today, the symptoms are real. They are involuntary. They are not feigned, and they are not chosen. And a person experiencing them cannot stop by deciding to. The word hysteria was abandoned precisely because it carried the implication that they could. It carried a great deal else besides. It is built from the Greek word for the womb, and it was for centuries a way of not listening to women. If any of this is close to you, I hope it is some small use to hear it said that the people who danced in Strasbourg in 1518 were not pretending, and that nobody has thought so for a long time. The closest comparison is tarantism, and it is the one I would point anybody to who wants to understand Strasbourg. In Apulia, in the heel of Italy, from the 13th century onward, and in a residual form as late as 1959, people, overwhelmingly women, would fall into a state of compulsive, agitated dancing, It was attributed to the bite of a spider. And the cure was music. The tarantella, played at length, sometimes for days, until the poison was danced out. And it happened in the summer. Only in the summer. In June of 1959, the Italian anthropologist Ernesto de Martino took a team down to the Salento to actually study it. A psychologist, a psychiatrist, an ethnomusicologist, and an anthropologist working together. What they found was that there was no relationship to spider bites at all. Many of the participants freely admitted they had not been bitten by anything. What de Martino concluded instead was that tarantism was a culturally conditioned ritual, a rite that let acute private distress be expressed publicly, in a form the community recognized and could respond to. A compulsive dancing affliction, attributed for 700 years with total confidence to a physical poison. And when trained investigators finally went and looked, with instruments and controls and interviews, the poison was not there. The culture was. That is the single best reason to be skeptical of the ergot theory. Not because a toxin is impossible, but because we have run this exact experiment once, where the people were still alive to ask, and the toxin turned out to be a story the community told about itself. Which brings me to the third answer, the one you will not hear in most tellings. It is not that the cause was something else. It is that the question might be malformed. The argument comes from the German historian, Gregor Rohmann, and it is the most radical one available. His position is that dancing mania has stayed an enigma for so long, precisely because scholars keep treating it as a fixed medical syndrome, sitting out there in history, waiting to be identified. He rejects every single cause explanation: hysteria, neurological disease, ergotism, mass psychology, equally and on the same grounds. His positive account is this: dancing began as an ordinary element of Christian liturgy and folk piety. It was worship. Over the following centuries, theology, then medicine, then psychiatry, progressively reframed that embodied expression as an involuntary affliction. And he dates the reframing to the 15th and early 16th centuries, which is to say, to right around 1518. We did not find the dancing disease. We built it, and Strasbourg is one of the places where we were building it. Let me show you the construction happening, because you can trace it, document by document, and once you have seen it, you cannot unsee it. Start with Sebastian Brant, contemporary, city chancellor, writing in 1518. What he gives us: dancing and the council's measures. No stage, no hired strongmen, no number, no deaths. Move forward 60 or 70 years to Daniel Specklin, the city architect. Now we have the guild halls, the wooden stage, the hired musicians, the strong men holding people upright, the red shoes and the consecrated oil. The Imlin chronicle gives us 400. Then 1636, an anonymous astrological chronicle, 118 years after the summer in question. And here, for the first time in the record, people die. And then, in 1832, a German physician named Justus Hecker took every scattered account of dancing across 500 years and welded them into a single continuous pan-European epidemic with a name and a natural history. Hecke is where the modern legend actually comes from, not from 1518, from 1832, and the 15 deaths a day entered popular culture from there, repeated ever since by people who believed they were repeating a fact from the 16th century. Notice the direction of travel. The further a source is from that summer, the more it contains. The detail does not decay with distance, the way real information decays. It accumulates. That is the signature of a story being written, rather than a memory being preserved. So let us lay out what we actually have. 3 things seem safe to assert. The first, something happened in Strasbourg in the summer of 1518. Brant is contemporary. The council's emergency measures are in the municipal archive. People danced. The city built them a stage. That is not legend. That is administration. And administration leaves paper. The second, it was not the bread. Not because ergotism is exotic or unlikely. It is neither. But for a series of concrete reasons. Chief among them, that ergot's vasoconstriction and burning pain make sustained dancing physiologically impossible, and that gangrene is absent from accounts written by people who knew gangrenous ergotism intimately. And the third, everything downstream of the bare event thins out the closer you look at it. The 400 is single source. The stage and the strong men come from a man writing 60 years later. The deaths rest on a chronicle written 118 years after the fact. And here is what cannot be settled. We do not know whether anyone died of it. We do not know how many danced, 50 or 400 or something in between. We do not know whether the first dancer had the name we have given her, whether Troffea is a real woman's name or a chronicler's kindness, the thing you add when a story needs someone in it. And we do not know, this is the deepest one, whether the dancing plague is a thing that happened or a category that we invented. Because notice, at the end of all this, that the 2 most serious modern scholars of the event are not actually arguing with each other. They are answering different questions. Waller asks, what psychological mechanism made those bodies move that way, in that place, in that summer? And he gives a good answer: distress, dissociation, and a culturally supplied script named St Vitus, amplified catastrophically by a city council that put the whole thing on a stage. Rohmann asks, was there ever a dancing disease at all? Or is it a category the 19th century assembled out of scattered and dissimilar incidents, gave a name and a natural history, and then read backwards into a Rhineland summer that had understood itself in completely different terms? And you can accept every single objection to the ergot theory. I think you should. And still not know which of those 2 questions the summer of 1518 is an answer to. That is not a failure of the historians. That is the actual shape of the evidence. But there is one observation I have not been able to stop thinking about, and I want to leave it with you. After 1518, there were no more large outbreaks of the dancing madness on European soil. Not diminishing, not moving elsewhere, ending. Waller's explanation is that the Reformation's attack on the cult of the saints probably had a great deal to do with it, and that by the late 17th century, a rising tide of secularism had made epidemics of dancing virtually unthinkable. Look at what that means. If the dancing was a script, and the script was St Vitus, then what happened next is that Strasbourg stopped believing in St Vitus, and thereby stopped being able to catch him. The red shoes went into a cupboard. The relief of Vitus in the grotto above Saverne stopped being a place you took your sick. The whole apparatus that had made the curse thinkable was dismantled, deliberately, by people who thought they were doing something else entirely. And the disease went away. Not cured, not treated, not understood, discontinued. I think we keep coming back to this story for a particular reason. If John Waller is even approximately right, if extreme distress can be routed by a shared belief into one specific bodily form, so precisely that 400 separate nervous systems in one city produce the same behavior in the same 8 weeks, then the boundary between the mind and the body is not a wall. It is a translation layer, and the language it translates into is not fixed. It is whatever the culture happens to be speaking that year. In 16th century Alsace, the available language was St Vitus, and so the distress came out as dancing. In a Tanzanian boarding school in 1962, it came out as laughter that was not laughter. In an American textile mill the same year, it was an insect nobody could find. Waller again, and this is the sentence to fall asleep on. The symptoms of mental illnesses are not fixed and unchanging. They can be modified by changing cultural milieus. They were not stupid. They had physicians who ruled out astrology and the supernatural on principle, and a chancellor who had written the standard work on human folly, and a written constitution they swore to in public every January, and 70 printing houses. They had every tool their century could give them, and they used all of them, carefully, in order, in good faith. And they built a stage. We do not know her name, really. We do not know what she was frightened of, or hungry for, or grieving on the morning she came out of her door into that street. We do not know whether she survived the summer. She was poor, and the poor of Strasbourg in 1518 do not appear in the archive except in aggregate, as grain prices, as hospital admissions, as 300 children in an orphanage. The only thing the record kept of her is that she went outside on a hot morning in the middle of July, and she began to move, and she could not stop, and a whole city looked at that, and did not think she was mad, and did not think she was faking, and did not think she was possessed by a devil. They thought she was ill. They sent their best physicians. The physicians examined her and told the truth as they understood it. The council spent public money. They hired musicians. They cleared the halls. They built the platform. Everything they did was wrong, and everything they did made it worse, and everything they did was an attempt to help. Sleep well.